This is Betrayal of the single worst D&D group. Railroads, guilt-tripping, and rule-changing at the whims of the GM, all supported by those players loyal to them. Good day, mates and fellow adventurers. My name is Mordecai. You know, there's something potentially appealing about having your campaign act like a train on a railroad. That being if the person or party in charge of driving a train is psychotic enough, such as a certain orc that I would prefer to never see again, that they can drive the train at such extreme speeds around tight corners to have the entire train crash. Just like WotC's initial plans with OGL 1.1. But that's its own can of worms. Scratch that joke off the easy joke list for the month. Wait, who wrote this section? More often than not, such a train wreck is caused by a GM who is determined to run their game like it's a novel, perfectly following a railroad off to the station at the end of the line. Which we can all agree is a novel approach to removing the spine of the story, that being player agency. Granted, for one-shots or miniature campaigns, you do want to have your players follow a central storyline, but that's a storyline, and thus it should be flexible to accommodate player decisions. And that's why the art of railroading is often considered the hallmark of a bad GM. I'm sure you can all envision what would happen if such a GM had an entire group which blindly supported that and other terrible decisions made by said GM. Before we get started with the story for the video, if I get to 1000 subs before the end of 2023, I have plans to cover an RPG story which predates the subreddit and contains one of the most infamous characters in all of tabletop role-playing game history. Unfortunately, I have to give a content warning for body horror and forced slavery with this story. Here's a timestamp if you want to skip it. With that, let's delve into the often terrifying world of r/RPGHorrorStories. Today's narrative is titled DM That Can't Ever Communicate Ideas Makes for a Miserable Campaign, and is written by user Spiteful RRDMTA. Oh boy, did I have a fun DM a while back. It all started when I joined a Roman Empire themed game. I'm a big history nerd. I think that entire era of human civilization is intriguing, and I was still getting adjusted to D&D, so this seemed like a great campaign fit for me. But dear God, was I wrong. So wrong. The first sign of trouble was when our group was captured. We had a new player to be introduced, and the DM wanted us to be introduced to her in a fighting arena type situation. Nothing inherently wrong with that, but he wanted it done in a way that was incredibly awkward. I was playing a Goliath, whose village had been saved by the family of another PC who was a human. We were walking through a city, and we were being led down a narrow passageway by a very shady dwarf. Given that my character felt a life debt to the other PC, I took on the role of a bodyguard, and voiced my concerns about the passage. Some of the party agreed, but the DM essentially forced us to, saying things like, "But you are almost at your destination!" and "Come on guys, I worked really hard on this!" and all that other nonsense. Basically, we wouldn't get much of a say, which became a recurring theme. I know this one is not that bad, but just hold your judgment until the end of the story. So we follow the dwarf, and we are suddenly locked in a room. Some knockout gas suddenly fills the room, and we have to make stupidly high constitution saves. I was a Goliath with high constitution and resistance to poisonous gases, so I made it easy, and so did the other PC my character was protecting. I stated that we would gladly stand and fight. So naturally there was also a net that we didn't see in the room before that dropped down upon us. However, I immediately succeed my rolls to get through it, and I help the other PC. The DM becomes audibly frustrated, and says a sorcerer casts a sleeping spell. I failed the check, but the other PC didn't. So the DM then has 20 guards enter the room to demand he accept being captured. We finally accept the DM won't let us play this out any other way, and just continue on with the story. We are then brought to an arena for entertainment by the Dark Elf. We have these magical collars slapped onto us that are immune to any and all attempts to get them off, be they mechanical, damage, or magic. And due to the nature of these slave collars, we are forced to obey the every word of our masters, and we are forced to fight through his challenges. We meet our new party member, and then we continue our fighting until he decides to have the Imperial Legion come rescue us after they attack the city. We didn't really get anything of value out of the fighting. It wasn't even enough to warrant a level up, apparently. All we did was meet our new party member, and you can't tell me that there isn't a better way to do so. So, already, really feeling like this campaign is going to be a ride-on-rails adventure. But maybe the GM was just struggling with how to bring new people in? Whatever. The next session we find a magic item, and one of the players cast Identify on it, and it was a Staff of Fire. Most of us know what a Staff of Fire does, so the character starts explaining what it does to one of the new players. The GM freaks out and accuses him of metagaming? We point out that he is from a highly educated aristocratic family, and he would definitely have that sort of knowledge, and that he had cast Identify on the magic item. The GM gets angry and tells us that that isn't how Identify works in his setting. That he has changed how Identify works, and we have to accept his ruling, even though he didn't tell us in advance. Which is another recurring theme. Oh, hold on a second, let me just dust these off. So, fast forward a couple of sessions, and we kill the big bad way too early. The big bad was supposed to be a vampire that was in the other PC's family, an ancestor. We managed to knock him into the sunlight. I just get insanely lucky on some holy attacks, and we kill him. The next 2 sessions go by without incident, and then we encounter another vampire. Now, this vampire is just an underling to an even stronger vampire. My character, sensing an opportunity, decides to try to work with this underling. I suggest that we can all work together and bring down his master. Then we can split his domain, and he can live another day. The GM, instead of letting me roleplay this out, decides that he needs to question me out of character. He literally asks if I am betraying the party, and questions my motives. While I was trying to either trick the vampire or stall for time, another player launches an attack on the vampire, and the fight begins. So I decide that since my ruse has failed, I will charge in. Suddenly, one of the other players in the campaign uses an attack of opportunity on me. The vampire had charmed her when we first entered the room, silently, and she was now attacking me. Her attack fails, and I reach the vampire. So, what does she do? Oh, nothing major. She just uses a 4th level moonbeam on me. Now, first of all, she initially centers it on me, so I say, well, at least you're hitting the vampire? To which the DM said, oh, then you must have meant to cast it 1 tile over. I called out this nonsense, but he went through with it anyways. Now is a great time to mention that when it comes to a DM who is dedicated to making their story a railroad, that it's pretty standard to have them bring out consequences simply because the players aren't on board with the railroad. Though I get the impression as well that the party member casting Moonbeam is more of a willing betrayer, since we don't get any mention of a saving throw against the charm by this player. Back to the story. We still managed to win the fight, but I call her out after that. She says that she was charmed, so he was controlling her, and she was forced to attack me. I point out that vampiric charm doesn't work like that it makes you view them as a best friend to protect and listen to, that she had not yet been ordered to attack us, and so at that point, she was literally casting her highest possible attack on one friend to stop him from fighting another. That is when the DM stepped in. They had planned it before the session since we killed the last vampire too easily. That's right, his attempt to balance the encounter was to have one of the players forced onto the enemy's team without any of us knowing. He had planned for her to be taken over, and for her to fight on his side. I again stress that Vampire Charm does not make you do all of this, and that she shouldn't have been simply immediately attacking us without the vampire taking the action to convince her. I argue also that she should have seen it as a fight between friends, and should have been trying to resolve the fight or separate us without trying to kill her party. That she should have at least tried something more along the lines of a grapple or physically separating us before blasting me with her highest level spell. And the DM's response? In my world it is. You aren't accepting my ruling. No pony. I point out that that fundamentally changes the dynamics of Charm, and I would have grabbed it as a spell if I knew it was just an upcasted version of Dominate Mind. That I could have gone Bard and found a way to get 2 casts of Charm going at once, allowing me to charm half a dozen enemies every encounter to attack bosses. That this all would have been fine if he had at least explained the change before it was sprung on us, so we could plan accordingly. But the GM refused to budge, and told me to accept the ruling. So I did. My friend and I are not very happy though. By this point, we are starting to get annoyed by him changing how fundamental things work without telling us in advance. He just seems interested in telling exactly the story he wants, and he doesn't care to let us play outside his narrow confines. The GM doesn't care if he has to fundamentally alter the rules of basic D&D content, so long as he gets to tell his story. He doesn't care about us, just his plot. But I have already invested so much time into the campaign, so I tolerate all of the nonsense. But then came the straw that broke the proverbial camel's back. We were sent to talk with the elves for help with something. When we teleported over, however, we found ourselves under attack by spiders and some other creatures. We survive the encounter and find our way to the elf city we were originally going to. We are told that an arachne is coordinating spider forces to attack the elves to help the drow and their spider queen. We are informed that multiple of their best hunters were sent out, but all of them were killed and eaten. Remember this, I swear it is important. They are concerned that their city will be overwhelmed, so we agree to go kill the arachne for them. So we go, we kill the arachne and her minions with little trouble, and we return to the city. We are treated to a banquet, and the GM starts describing the scene. He mentions that large buffet tables are spread around the room, with an unimaginable number of fruits, vegetables and grains. He specifically makes a note that my character is sad to see that there is no meat around. To this, I jokingly retort, well, there are elves around. I made that entirely in jest, and I said it while he was describing the setting, so I clearly meant it as an out-of-character joke. But before I can even explain, the elf and the half-elf in our party immediately roll to try to intimidate me. I succeed against the checks and counter-intimidate them back. Suddenly, I am pulled out of the dining hall and into the forests. A humanoid approaches me and demands to know why I want to eat elves? What? I say I don't, and it was just a joke. This entity then demands I apologize, to which I refuse. I am then sent back to the banquet, without my armor or my weapons. All of this has happened in the span of about 90 seconds in-game. At this point, I am overwhelmed and doubling down, since I have so little time to think. The rest of my party is confused as I disappeared and reappeared without my stuff. A random priest then says that I must have pissed off their patron deity. Okay, so here's the minor content warning for themes of body horror. Here's a timestamp to skip ahead to if you want to skip this particular horror. My character hears a voice in his head a moment later, asking if I will apologize yet. I am still reeling from how stupid this all is, and I am still defensive after being attacked by multiple players and the GM, so I double down and say no, that I have done nothing wrong. So then, my clothes and other items are taken away, rinse and repeat. Then my character is teleported away again, and this time, I'm in front of the humanoid that is the elven deity again. They demand I apologize for my one-line joke, and again I refuse because all of this is just completely absurd. So my character gets polymorphed permanently from a Goliath to a human, and then my character is chained to a tree, for I will have to every day make a constitution save until I fail and am forced to apologize. So I call his challenge and roll, and I somehow succeed on the save. The GM is very frustrated at this point, and demands to know what my end goal is. I reply by asking what his end goal is, since he is literally permanently polymorphing my character and literally taking away all of my equipment over a joke. His response was as follows. In this campaign, gods are very real, and can and do get involved with the world. I didn't take that as a joke. After all, you didn't say that you were joking right away, and you were in the heart of elven power. Now, first of all, when are gods not very real in D&D? I am pretty sure it would be unusual for gods to not be real, or am I going insane? Second, every time I say a throwaway line, am I supposed to stop the entire campaign to say, oh, and by the way, before anyone gets offended or I piss off a local deity, I must interrupt to clarify that what I said was meant to be taken in a joking manner. My character should not be held liable for any offense that comes from it, as I do not mean it in any other way other than as comedic relief. Please do not smite me. It is worth mentioning that my character had never shown any evil tendencies as a paladin, so it should have been obviously a joke. And since it was said during the description of the room, in response to something that the GM told me specifically, it should have been seen as an out-of-character comment. But even if all of that was not clear, what actually happened was my character looked sad, and then said, well, there are elves around. So the rest of the party metagamed that to mean I wanted to eat an elf. But now the biggest issue I pointed out to him. If the elven god is real and gets so angry over a joke that he polymorphs and tortures someone after stealing their gear, where was this god when their elves were literally being eaten by monsters? You know, the monsters that were literally eating their best soldiers, and the drow were planning an attack, so their god just stood by and watched the complete nonsense and giggles? Why would the elven god go so far out of their way to punish a joke made by someone who just saved the elves, whilst also allowing monsters to roam free and eat their elves? The GM literally had no answer. He just said the gods do as they will. But I pushed back and pointed out that the god's motivation is entirely inconsistent with the god's actions. The GM then says I have been a jerk ever since the Charmed episode, and that I need to apologize for the joke. This whole elf situation was so infuriating that I left the campaign over it. And my friend left the next session when I was being completely kicked into the dirt by the GM and their party. It was just such a nightmare. The GM was constantly changing rules on the fly and making such bizarre and bad decisions. It was baffling being there. The GM and my friend were in another campaign together as players, and he was also hostile to me there too. Eventually he was ejected from that campaign because he was just an all-round terrible player who, ironically enough, would not listen to the GM's ruling and whined every time something didn't go his way. And this explains my username. I am spiteful, and the railroading DM is the jerk. And that's where the story ends. Somehow, I don't think the inability of the DM to communicate was the biggest issue. Is it just me, or was the entire group, minus the poster and their friend, in on the GM's intended railroad of madness? Because that sure seems to be the case here. From the players being mostly perfectly okay with the GM suddenly changing how basic mechanics work with no prior warning, changing how the rules themselves worked on a whim, and of course, punishing the one player who was calling into question just how terrible the GM's decision making actually was. Then again, if that's exactly the kind of game that the GM and the entire group by extension wanted, there isn't exactly much that could have been done aside from making sure that the GM never sits behind the GM screen again. If you want a lightning round of every problem the GM and perhaps the broader party by extension caused, we have forced railroading. We have forced domination on players without consent. We have on-the-fly rule changing with no prior warning. We have a GM who will metagame alongside their party to punish players who fall out of line. We also have intentional guilt tripping to force the party into the railroad. And then we have extreme consequences in-game for an out-of-game joke that was taken out of context by the entire party. We have the party which unquestioningly accepted all of this from the problem GM. And we have the GM attempting to rules lawyer their interpretation of the rules on a different game when they are a player. I am not surprised on that last one. Clearly, there is a rather significant disparity between how D&D's rules are written and even intended versus how the problem GM wants to run their story. Sure, rulings can be more important than the rules, as long as those rulings are at least grounded in the rules. Buffing charm effects to the point where it is a cheaper, more effective version of domination, giving NPCs items to dominate the party and make them do their bidding, having no saving throw for the effects of a permanent polymorph, and having the party go along with player versus player action without any warning? I mean, maybe this would have been okay if this was communicated in Session 0, but it wasn't. This goes against the principles of rules as written and rules as intended. And no, this isn't really the story of rules as written going up against rules as intended in a boxing match. That's a different can of worms. It's more like the problem GM had a group that enabled and encouraged him to come up with a truly evil way to run the game. And when someone was brave enough to call that evil out, they were mercilessly punished. Multiple times. That's why I say that, if the story is true, that this is the single worst D&D group of all time. Now, I know what you might be thinking. Mordecai, this is far from the worst group. There are a lot of groups out there which do things that are far more egregious, and some of those atrocities could be called war crimes against the tabletop role-playing community at large. And you're right, there are far worse instances of bad groups. Though most of the really bad groups, you hear about them once, and then they vanish into obscurity. However, what makes this the worst group is that under any other circumstances, this group is highly accessible to every D&D player out there. So even if this isn't the worst D&D group, it's very much a heavyweight in the category. That makes me wonder just how many players have had this group inflict an awful experience upon them. My only advice for players who find themselves in a game like this, do try to have a conversation with the GM out of game. Inform them about what's not working, and provide some feedback if you can. But if that changes nothing, run. Find an alternative group. Do anything but stay in a group like this. After all, having no D&D is preferable to having bad D&D. Thank you for watching the video. If you like my content and want to see more or wish to support the channel, please hit the subscribe button and maybe leave the video a like. It's free to do, and every bit of support is highly appreciated. Again, thank you for watching, and I shall see you all next time.